here, okay? The Armenian Genocide happened. It existed, it's true, okay? I don't know how I could be any clearer than that. So I know that some Turkish folks grew up believing in things that were taught to them, whether it was in Turkey or through other means, and I know because I lived that, right? I'm a Turkish-American, and I grew up believing the things that I was taught. Looking back on it, some of it is absolutely absurd. And Armenian genocide is an incredibly serious issue. I'm only saying this in the context of other things that I was taught in Turkey are now, you look back, are comical. So I remember that we were taught when I was in 3rd grade, but apparently we had some history between 1st and 3rd grade there. And I remember we were taught that the Turks had never lost a war other than World War I, because that one was a little hard to deny. And then later, when I read stuff about how Turks had lost many different wars, I was confused at first. Because when you get taught something when you're a kid, it is super hard to break, including religion, right? And so, of course Turks have lost wars, that's preposterous, right? And I remember we used to chant when I was a kid, Turkey's the biggest, there's no other country that's big. Preposterous, right? So that's the context in which I grew up. And so looking back at some of the stuff I wrote, there is an American colonel who said, for example, the Armenians returned fat and entirely unmassacred. Preposterous. When I read it at the time, I didn't have the context of being an adult like I am now, and that lasted far too long, by the way, my ignorance on the topic. And I couldn't understand what I know now. If I had read that now, I'd go, wait a minute, nobody returned unmassacred, let alone all the other things that he said. And to my Turkish friends who are deeply offended by all of this, and yes, and if you live in America, you say, oh, it's their fault and they're terrible, etc. But they're taught a certain thing, and so when they're challenged on this, they say, no, well, it was a civil war, it was just massacres. Really? That's what you're gonna say? No one denies that there were massacres. There was definitely terrible massacres. No one denies that the Armenians were driven out. So your big contention is, well, technically I don't want to call that a genocide. First of all, you're factually incorrect.